My husband was poking holes in our condoms to trap me with a baby. I caught him red-handed. Everyone, I'm back with another story. And this one is probably the most disturbing thing that's ever happened to me. It's about how I discovered that my own husband was secretly sabotaging our birth control to get me pregnant without my consent. When I tell you I caught him red-handed, I mean I literally walked in on him poking holes in our condoms with a needle. The betrayal I felt in that moment is something I'll never forget, and what happened afterward completely changed my life. Let me start from the beginning so you can understand the full scope of this nightmare. My name is Jessica, and at the time this happened, I was 28 years old and had been married to my husband David for 3 years. We'd been together for 5 years total. And I genuinely thought I knew this man inside and out. He was charming, successful, and seemed to respect my choices and boundaries, or so I thought. From the very beginning of our relationship, I was crystal clear about my feelings on having children. I wasn't ready then, and honestly, I wasn't sure I ever would. I had career goals I wanted to achieve first, personal growth I needed to work on, and frankly, the idea of pregnancy and motherhood terrified me. David always said he understood, and that he was happy to wait until I was ready, if I ever was ready at all. This wasn't some casual conversation we had once and never revisited. We talked about it regularly throughout our relationship. When we got engaged, we discussed it extensively. When we got married, we had another serious conversation about our timeline and our birth control methods. David always seemed supportive of my position, always reassured me that there was no pressure, and always emphasized that my body was my choice. We used condoms as our primary method of birth control because I didn't want to deal with the side effects of hormonal birth control, and David said he was perfectly fine with that. He even offered to get a vasectomy at one point, but I told him that wasn't necessary since we weren't sure what we'd want in the future. I thought I was being considerate by not asking him to make such a permanent decision when my own feelings might change someday. Looking back now, I realized that David's offer to get a vasectomy was probably just a manipulation tactic to make me think he was genuinely supportive of my choice not to have children. He knew I'd never ask him to go through with it, so it was a safe offer to make that would score him points for being understanding and supportive. Everything seemed normal in our marriage for the first couple of years. We both had demanding careers. I was working as a marketing manager at a tech startup, and David was a financial advisor with his own growing client base. We were focused on building our professional lives and enjoying our time together as a couple. We traveled, we went out with friends, we were happy. Or at least, I thought we were both happy. The first red flag I should have noticed was how David's attitude toward children started changing subtly around our second year of marriage. He began making comments about how cute babies were when we'd see them in public. He'd point out happy families and make remarks about how fulfilling parenthood must be. He started bringing up friends who had recently had children and talking about how much joy kids brought to their lives. At first, I thought this was just natural maturation. People change their perspectives as they get older, and I figured maybe David was starting to warm up to the idea of having children eventually. I didn't think anything sinister was going on. I just thought he was beginning to consider the possibility of parenthood in our future. But then the comments became more frequent and more pointed. David would make jokes about how I'd be a great mom someday, how our kids would be so lucky to have me, how he couldn't wait to see me pregnant. When I'd remind him that I wasn't ready and might never be ready, he'd laugh it off and say he was just thinking out loud, that there was no pressure. The real turning point came about 6 months ago when David's sister announced her pregnancy. He was over the moon excited to become an uncle, which I thought was sweet, but his reaction was intense in a way that made me uncomfortable. He immediately started talking about baby names, about how he wanted to be the best uncle ever, about how much he was looking forward to having a baby in the family. Then he started making comments about how seeing his sister pregnant made him realize how much he wanted children of his own. He'd say things like, "Watching Sarah go through this pregnancy is making me think about when we'll start trying, or I can't wait until it's our turn to make this kind of announcement." Every time he made these comments, I'd remind him that we had agreed to wait, that I wasn't ready, and that I might never be ready. His response was always the same. He'd apologize, say he got carried away, and promise that he wasn't trying to pressure me. But the comments kept coming, and they were becoming more frequent and more assumptive. I started feeling like David was expecting me to change my mind about having children. Like he was just waiting for me to come around to his way of thinking. But what really worried me was that he seemed to be operating under the assumption that I would definitely change my mind, not that I might change my mind, about 4 months ago. I started experiencing some unusual symptoms. I was feeling nauseous. In the mornings, my breasts were tender, and I was more tired than usual. My period was a few days late, which wasn't completely abnormal for me, but combined with the other symptoms, I started to worry that I might be pregnant. I bought a pregnancy test and took it immediately. It was negative, and I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me. I realized in that moment just how much the idea of being pregnant terrified me, and it reinforced my certainty that I wasn't ready for children. But then the same thing happened again the next month. Same symptoms, same late period, same anxiety about potentially being pregnant. Again, the test was negative, but I was starting to get concerned about why my body was acting so strangely. I made an appointment with my gynecologist to discuss what might be causing these symptoms. She ran some tests, and everything came back normal. She suggested that stress might be a factor, or that my body might just be going through some natural changes. She also asked about my birth control method and whether I was using it consistently. I told her we used condoms every time, and that David was always responsible about using them properly. She nodded and said that condoms were very effective when used correctly, but reminded me that no birth control method was 100% foolproof. She suggested that if I was really concerned about pregnancy, I might want to consider using a secondary method of birth control. I left that appointment feeling reassured that nothing was seriously wrong with my health, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The timing of these symptoms, combined with David's increasing pressure about having children, was making me feel paranoid and anxious. That's when I started paying closer attention to our birth control routine. I noticed that David always insisted on being the one to get the condoms from our bedside drawer. He'd always been that way. And I'd never thought anything of it because it seemed like he was just being responsible and taking initiative. But now I was wondering if there was another reason he wanted to be in control of our birth control. I started watching him more carefully when he'd get the condoms, and I noticed that he would sometimes pause for a moment while handling the package, like he was examining it before opening it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that stress was making me suspicious of perfectly normal behavior. David loved me. He respected my choices. He would never do anything to violate my trust or my bodily autonomy. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. About 3 months ago, I decided to start keeping track of our birth control more carefully. I began checking the condom packages before we used them, looking for any signs of tampering or damage. Everything seemed normal, but I noticed that David seemed a little irritated when I'd examine the packages before we used them. "What are you doing?" he asked one night when I was looking at a condom package more closely than usual. "Just making sure it's "Not expired or damaged," I said, which was partially true. "You don't trust me to check that," he replied, and there was an edge to his voice that I'd never heard before when we talked about birth control. "Of course I trust you," I said quickly. "I'm just being extra careful because I've been having some weird symptoms lately." David's expression softened, and he apologized for snapping at me. He said he understood why I was being cautious, and that he appreciated how responsible I was being about our birth control. But something about his reaction stuck with me. Why would he be irritated by me double-checking our condoms? 2 months ago, I made a decision that probably saved my life and my future. I decided to buy my own condoms and keep them hidden in my car, without telling David about them. My plan was to occasionally substitute my condoms for his, just to see if there was any difference in quality or effectiveness. I know it sounds crazy, but my intuition was screaming that something was wrong, and I needed to either confirm my suspicions or put them to rest once and for all. I bought a box of the same brand and type that David always purchased, and I kept them in a small bag in my car's glove compartment. The first few times I used my condoms instead of David's, I didn't notice any difference. Everything seemed normal. And I started to think that I was just being paranoid and suspicious for no reason. Maybe my weird symptoms really were just stress-related. And David's comments about children were just normal husband behavior, not signs of some sinister plot. But then, about 6 weeks ago, I used one of David's condoms and noticed something that made my blood run cold. After we were finished, I was cleaning up, and I noticed that the condom looked different than usual. There were tiny punctures in it that looked too small and too perfectly round to be accidental tears. I stared at that condom for probably 5 full minutes, trying to convince myself that I was seeing things, that these were just normal wear marks or manufacturing defects. But the more I looked at them, the more obvious it became that these were deliberate holes, probably made with a needle or pin. I felt like I was going to throw up. My own husband, the man I trusted with my life and my future, was sabotaging our birth control to get me pregnant without my consent. The betrayal was so complete and so shocking that I couldn't even process it at first. I knew I needed more evidence before I could confront David about this. Maybe this was just one defective condom. Maybe I was still being paranoid. So I decided to examine the remaining condoms in David's stash without him knowing. The next day, while David was at work, I went through the box of condoms in our bedside drawer. What I found confirmed my worst fears and then some. Almost every single condom had tiny, barely visible holes punched through the packaging and into the condom itself. These weren't random manufacturing defects. They were deliberate, systematic sabotage. I was shaking as I examined each package. Some had 1 or 2 holes, others had several. They were always in places that would be hard to notice, never near the edges of the package, always in areas that would be covered by the wrapper design. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and had taken care to make the sabotage as undetectable as possible. I took pictures of every single package, documenting the holes and the damage. I needed evidence of what David was doing, both for my own sanity and in case I needed to involve authorities later. What he was doing wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was reproductive coercion, and in many places it's considered a form of sexual assault, but I still needed to catch him. In the act, I needed to see David actually sabotaging the condoms so that he couldn't deny it or make me feel like I was crazy. I needed absolute proof of what he was doing so that he couldn't manipulate me into believing I was imagining things. So I set a trap. I replaced all of David's sabotaged condoms with new, undamaged ones from my secret stash. Then I installed a small security camera in our bedroom, hidden where David wouldn't notice it, but where it would capture anyone tampering with the bedside drawer. I felt sick doing this. I was literally spying on my own husband in our own bedroom because I suspected him of reproductive coercion. The fact that it had come to this point was devastating, but I needed to know the truth. It took less than a week for David to take the bait. I was at work late one evening when I got a motion alert from the hidden camera. I checked the feed from my phone and watched in real time as my husband opened our bedside drawer, took out the box of condoms, and began systematically poking holes in each package with what looked like a large sewing needle. I watched him work methodically through the entire box, making sure to puncture each condom in multiple places while being careful not to make the holes too obvious. He was calm, focused, and clearly experienced at this task. This wasn't the first time he'd done this, probably not even the 10th time. The most chilling part was watching his face while he worked. He looked satisfied, almost happy, like he was doing something productive and beneficial. There was no guilt, no hesitation, no sign that he understood the gravity of what he was doing to me and to our marriage. After he finished sabotaging all the condoms, he carefully put everything back exactly as it had been and went back to his normal evening routine. When I got home an hour later, he greeted me with a kiss and asked about my day like nothing had happened. I had my proof, but I wasn't ready to confront him yet. I needed time to process what I'd discovered and to figure out what I was going to do about it. I was married to a man who was actively trying to get me pregnant against my will, who had probably been doing this for months, and who was so committed to his plan that he'd invested in special tools and developed a systematic approach. The next few days were torture. I had to act normal around David while knowing what he was doing to me. Every time he touched me, every time he said he loved me, every time he made plans for our future. I was thinking about those holes he'd poked in our condoms and wondering how long this had been going on. I started thinking back over the past few months, trying to remember when David might have started sabotaging our birth control. Those weird symptoms I'd been having, the nausea, the tender breasts, the fatigue, were the early signs of pregnancy that ended in very early miscarriages. Had David's sabotage actually worked before? But my body had naturally terminated the pregnancies before I even knew I was pregnant. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that David had been doing this for a while. The timeline matched up with when his comments about children had become more frequent and more assumptive. He'd probably started sabotaging our birth control around the same time he started acting like my eventual pregnancy was inevitable rather than a possibility I might choose. I realized I needed legal advice before I did anything else. What David was doing was clearly wrong, but I wasn't sure what my options were or how to protect myself. I made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in reproductive rights and domestic abuse cases. The lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. What David was doing was reproductive coercion, which is considered a form of domestic violence. In many jurisdictions, she explained that sabotaging birth control to cause pregnancy without consent is illegal in many places and can be prosecuted as sexual assault in some cases. She advised me to document everything thoroughly, which I'd already started doing, and to consider my options carefully. Did I want to try to work things out with David through counseling, or was this a deal breaker that meant I needed to end the marriage? She warned me that reproductive coercion often escalates and that men who engage in this behavior typically don't change without serious intervention. The lawyer also gave me some practical advice about protecting myself going forward. She suggested that I consider getting an IUD or other birth control method that David couldn't sabotage, and that I document everything in case I decided to pursue legal action or file for divorce. After that appointment, I knew I had to confront David, I couldn't keep living with this knowledge, and I couldn't keep pretending that our marriage was normal when he was actively violating my reproductive autonomy. I decided to wait until I had one more piece of evidence. I wanted to catch him sabotaging condoms again, so that he couldn't claim the first time was an isolated incident or some kind of misunderstanding. I didn't have to wait long, 3 days. Later, I got another motion alert from the hidden camera. This time, I rushed home and caught David in the act in person. I walked into our bedroom just as he was putting the needle back into his desk drawer after finishing his sabotage session. "What are you doing, David?" I asked quietly. He spun around, clearly startled and caught off guard. For a moment, he just stared at me like a deer in headlights. Then he tried to play it off casually, just organizing the bedside table, he said, moving to close the drawer that contained the condoms. With a needle, I asked, holding up my phone to show him the live video feed from the hidden camera. The color drained from his face completely. He looked at my phone, then at the camera, then back at my phone. I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out how to explain away what I'd just witnessed and recorded. Double quotes, "Jessica, I can explain." He started, but I cut him off. "Explain what?" "How you've been poking holes in our condoms to get me pregnant without my consent. How you've been violating my reproductive choices and my bodily autonomy. How you've been lying to my face for months about respecting my decision not to have children." David tried several different approaches to defend himself. First, he claimed that he'd only done it a couple of times and that he'd been planning to tell me about it when I showed him the photos of all the sabotaged condoms I'd found. He switched tactics and said that he thought I was starting to change my mind about having children and that he was just trying to help nature along. When I pointed out that helping nature along without my knowledge or consent was reproductive coercion and potentially illegal, he got angry and accused me of being paranoid and setting traps for him. He said that a normal wife would trust her husband and wouldn't need to hide cameras and investigate his behavior. But the most revealing part of his defense was when he finally admitted that he'd been sabotaging our birth control for over 6 months because he was tired of waiting for me to decide I wanted children. According to David, I was being selfish and unreasonable by not wanting to start a family. And he was just taking action to give us both what we really wanted. "You'll thank me when we have a beautiful baby," he said, apparently believing that pregnancy would magically change my mind about wanting children. That's when I realized just how little David actually knew me or respected me as a person. He genuinely believed that my feelings about having children were just a phase I'd grow out of, and that he had the right to make reproductive decisions for both of us. He saw my body and my reproductive capacity as something he was entitled to control. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of my life. I told David that what he'd done was unforgivable, that it was a form of sexual assault, and that it had completely destroyed any trust I had in him. I explained that reproductive coercion is domestic violence and that many women consider it grounds for divorce. David's response was to minimize what he'd done and to try to manipulate me into forgiving him. He said that he loved me and just wanted us to have a family together. He claimed that he knew I'd be a great mother and that I'd be happy once I got pregnant. He even suggested that my resistance to having children was just fear that he could help me overcome when manipulation didn't work. He tried bargaining. He promised to stop sabotaging our birth control and to wait until I was ready to have children. He offered to go to counseling with me to work through our different perspectives on starting a family. He even said he'd consider getting a vasectomy, if that's what it took to rebuild my trust, but it was too late. The damage was done. David had spent months systematically violating my consent and my reproductive autonomy. He'd lied to my face repeatedly while actively working against my clearly stated wishes. He'd shown me that he fundamentally didn't respect my right to make decisions about my own body and my own future. More importantly, he'd shown me that he was willing to trick me into pregnancy because he believed he knew what was best for me. Better than I did. What would happen if I did get pregnant and wanted to terminate? Would he try to prevent me from making that choice too? What other decisions about my life and my body did he think he had the right to make for me? I told David that I was done with our marriage and that I'd be filing for divorce. I also told him that I was considering pressing criminal charges for reproductive coercion, depending on what my lawyer advised. His reaction to this news showed me exactly who he really was underneath the charming facade he'd maintained for 5 years. David became furious in a way I'd never seen before. He accused me of overreacting and being dramatic. He said that lots of couples accidentally got pregnant and figured things out, and that what he'd done wasn't really that different. He claimed that I was destroying our marriage over something that would have worked out fine in the end. When I pointed out that there was nothing accidental about systematically poking holes in condoms with a needle, he said that I was being technical and legalistic about what should be a private matter between husband and wife. He actually suggested that I was the one violating our marriage by involving lawyers and considering criminal charges. The most chilling moment came when David said that he didn't understand why I was so upset about the possibility of getting pregnant with his child. It's not like I was trying to get you pregnant by some stranger, he said. I'm your husband. Having my baby should be an honor, not a violation. That statement revealed everything I needed to know about David's mindset. He genuinely believed that being married to me gave him ownership over my reproductive capacity. He thought that his desire for children trumped my right to choose when and if to become pregnant. He saw my body as something he was entitled to use for his own purposes, regardless of my feelings or consent. I moved out that night and stayed with my sister while I figured out my next steps. David called and texted constantly for the first few days, alternating between apologetic messages and angry accusations. He claimed that I was abandoning our marriage over a misunderstanding, and that any reasonable woman would forgive her husband for wanting to start a family. When I didn't respond to his messages, David started involving other people in our situation. He called my parents, my siblings, and our mutual friends, telling them that I was leaving him because he wanted children and I didn't. He painted himself as the victim of an unreasonable wife who was throwing away a good marriage over a simple disagreement about timing. What David didn't expect was for me to tell people the truth about what he'd actually done. When my family and friends learned that he'd been sabotaging our birth control for months to trick me into pregnancy, their support for David evaporated immediately. Several people told me they were horrified by his behavior and that they'd never seen that side of him before. My divorce attorney was excellent and helped me navigate both the legal and emotional aspects of ending my marriage. We documented everything thoroughly, including the video evidence of David sabotaging condoms and the photos of the damaged packages. The attorney warned me that David might try to claim that I tampered with the evidence or that the whole thing was a misunderstanding, but the video footage made his intentions pretty clear. David hired his own attorney and initially tried to fight the divorce, claiming that our marriage could be saved with counseling. His lawyer advised him to stop discussing the reproductive coercion allegations and to focus on property division and other practical matters. But David couldn't help himself. He kept insisting that what he'd done wasn't really that wrong and that I was overreacting. The divorce proceedings revealed even more disturbing information about David's mindset and behavior during depositions. It came out that he'd been planning to sabotage our birth control since our second year of marriage. He'd researched different methods online and had chosen the needle approach because it was the least detectable. David also admitted that he'd been tracking my menstrual cycle without my knowledge, trying to time his sabotage to coincide with my most fertile periods. He'd been keeping notes about my symptoms and mood changes, apparently hoping to catch early signs of pregnancy before I realized what was happening. Most disturbing of all, David revealed that he'd had a backup plan in case the condom sabotage didn't work. He'd been researching ways to tamper with other forms of birth control and had even considered trying to drug me to lower my inhibitions about getting pregnant. The level of premeditation and planning he'd put into violating my reproductive autonomy was absolutely terrifying. The criminal case was more complicated than the divorce. While reproductive coercion is illegal in many jurisdictions, proving criminal intent can be difficult, and prosecution rates are relatively low. My attorney worked with the district attorney's office to evaluate whether criminal charges were appropriate in my case. Ultimately, David accepted a plea deal that included mandatory counseling about reproductive coercion and domestic violence, as well as a restraining order that prevented him from contacting me or interfering with my life in any way. He didn't have to admit guilt publicly, but the plea agreement was enough to ensure that he faced some consequences for his behavior. The whole process took almost a year to resolve completely. But I was finally free from David and able to start rebuilding my life. The experience changed me fundamentally, not just in terms of my ability to trust romantic partners, but in my understanding of how reproductive coercion works and how common it actually is. Through support groups and therapy, I learned that what happened to me wasn't unusual. Many women experience some form of reproductive coercion, whether it's partners sabotaging birth control, pressuring them to get pregnant, or preventing them from accessing reproductive health care. It's a form of domestic violence that often goes unrecognized and unreported. Today, I'm in a much better place. I've been in therapy to work through the trauma of what David did to me, and I've become an advocate for reproductive rights and domestic violence awareness. I speak at conferences and support groups about reproductive coercion, helping other women recognize the signs and understand their options. I'm also in a new relationship with someone who genuinely respects my autonomy and my choices about my body and my future. We've had extensive conversations about reproductive choices, and he's never once suggested that his preferences should override my decisions about my own body. The experience with David taught me that reproductive coercion is about power and control, not about love or wanting to start a family. Someone who truly loves you will respect your choices about when, how, and if to have children. They won't try to trick you, manipulate you, or force you into pregnancy against your will. If you're reading this and recognizing signs of reproductive coercion in your own relationship, please know that you're not alone and that help is available. What happened to me was not okay, and what might be happening to you is not okay either. Your body is your own, and no one has the right to make reproductive decisions for you without your knowledge and consent. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone out there recognize that they deserve better than a partner who would violate their trust and autonomy in such a fundamental way. Remember, reproductive coercion is domestic violence, and you deserve support and resources to protect yourself and your future.